Hello learners, welcome to the 28th lecture in this NPTEL course on the 20th century English novel, which we are studying through the work of a selected group of women writers. I have provided a somewhat detailed close reading of the first few paragraphs of the opening chapter of The Eyes Were Watching God. I'll continue with a deep immersion in the words and the world of this novel by reading some more quotations from the early pages of this novel. So, in the first chapter, we are introduced to the setting as well as the context. In a sense, we are introduced to a rhetorical situation. The rhetorical situation involves a sort of conflict between two voices. The first voice is that of the town or the people in the town who seem to have a very harsh, scathing judgment of the choices Janie Crawford has made in her life and seem to want to punish her and seem to derive some sort of sadistic pleasure in watching her suffer and watching her deal with the consequences. That is one. But towards the end of that chapter, we are shown how Janie finds one sympathetic voice in this town, that is Phoebe, who's an old friend of Janie's, who comes and sits with Janie, makes her a meal to eat, and sits down with her and asks Janie to tell Phoebe her story. Because, of course, everyone is curious about what happened to Janie because she left in not ideal circumstances. But instead of judging or finding some joy in Janie's suffering, because Janie did not conform to the expectations of normal or conventional femininity, Phoebe simply wants to hear Janie's story. So Janie starts telling her story, and that is how the subsequent chapters of the novel begin to unfold. And this is how the second chapter begins. Again, the first sentence always has a striking metaphor and very, very arresting image. The second chapter begins thus. Janie saw her life like a great tree in leaf, with the things suffered, things enjoyed, things done and undone. Dawn and doom was in the branches. And then Jenny goes on, I know exactly what I got to tell you, but it's hard to know where to start at. I never seen my papa, and I didn't know him if I did. My mama neither. She was gone from round there long before I was big enough to know. My grandma raised me. My grandma and the white folks she worked with. She had a house in the backyard, and that's where I was born. There was quality white folks up there in West Florida, named Washburn. She had 4 grandchildren on the place, and all of us played together, and that's how I never called my grandma nothing but Nanny, because that's what everybody on the place called her. Nanny used to catch us in our devilment and lick every young'un on the place, and Miss Washburn did the same. I reckon they never hit us a lick, a miss, because them 3 boys and us 2 girls was pretty aggravatin' as speck. Okay, I'll stop there with this thickly accented southern vernacular English, but this is also important for you all to note that this is a very important literary historical document, but it's also an important linguistic and ethnographic document. In fact, it's one of the best 4 or 5 novels ever written about the American South. And that's because it's a novel about the American South that captures in great detail. The novelist has a brilliant ear for the vernacular speech. Those of you who've read The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn will find some of the words familiar. But Huckleberry Finn is still cleaned up somewhat. It is still cleaned up for a lot of white American readers. And while Mark Twain does go much further than many contemporary American writers in engaging with the ethical and philosophical problems of racism and the politics of slavery, the language in Huckleberry Finn still can be understood as the language that a white Southern novelist translates in order to give non Southern American Anglophone readers a sort of information but also entertainment and humor from reading about how people in the Deep South talked. That level of translation is not present in this novel. In fact, the language that you read in The Eyes Were Watching God, it's not language that has been tempered or translated or anglicized for a non Southern reader. In fact, readers who have no idea of the American South should be warned and, in fact, should be asked to read a little bit of context before encountering this novel. The novelist does not make any compromises. The narrator does not clean up the speech of her protagonists in order to help a metropolitan or a more cosmopolitan or a more city based, or let's say a New York or London or New Delhi based reader, to make it easier for a reader based in these locations to understand these characters. No, readers have to do the work. They have to learn the language that these characters speak in order to understand the human dilemmas that these characters are dealing with. So, what is the first human dilemma? The first human dilemma is that of race. Now, this is a time when slavery has been abolished. The generation before Janie is born, and in fact, I'll read from a quote in which Janie's grandmother tells the story of how Janie's mother was born. Janie's mother was born a few days after Atlanta had fallen to Colonel Sherman. That is, at a key moment in the end of the Civil War. This is when Janie's mother is born. So Janie's mother is born free, but not yet. There was some ambiguity about the status of the newborn black child. And so Janie's grandmother decided to run with this newborn child. And this is a familiar story. Those of you who've read any slave narratives, Jacobs, Frederick Douglass, or any number of others, or maybe who've seen the TV show or the novel based on the Underground Railroad. This is a familiar story. Survival was often down to crossing state borders from slave owning to abolitionist states. Now, this is the story of Janie's mother. And so, Janie, as a child, grows up without this notion of slavery, but not without this notion of race. And so, the first story that Janie tells in this chapter is that of playing with a group of children on an estate that Janie's grandmother shared with, as Janie puts it, quality white folks, meaning white people who did not hold on to those 19th century notions of slavery. So these quality white folks had children and all the children played together, but Janie never had a sense that she was black. And the first moment in Janie's life when she realizes that she is black and therefore different and therefore not normal and therefore somewhat marked for a different fate from others around her was when she sees a photograph that's taken of all the children at the estate. And Janie has problems identifying herself, and someone else identifies Janie in the photograph to her. And then Janie asks, "Am I colored?" Right? And then she's told that yes, she is in fact colored. And so this is the introduction, a very harsh introduction into the realities of race relations in Reconstruction era American South. This is a moment that will also resonate with many of you who've read other novels. And a novel that comes to mind most powerfully is the first novel by Toni Morrison, The Bluest Eye, which is also about a young child, a female black child, who struggles with issues of perception and who struggles with issues of wanting to be seen as beautiful, but these ideas of beauty are defined by a very dominant white sensibility. And I don't mention Toni Morrison idly. I will discuss a little later in this course how The Eyes Were Watching God was among the most powerful influences on Toni Morrison, and especially on the conception, composition, and writing of Morrison's own novel about gender, femininity, motherhood, and race, which is Beloved, which we will also discuss later in this course. So, Janie Crawford gets this very harsh introduction to the realities of race, and a little bit later, we are immersed into a very problematic set of revelations, and also revelations which take the narrative forward at a very fast pace. So, what happens is one day, and apparently a few years have passed since this moment when the little girl Janie discovers that she's colored. So a few years have passed, and one day Janie's grandmother catches her kissing a boy on the estate. And it's that moment which triggers a lot of developments in the novel. It triggers the first marriage that Janie is forced into. It triggers a lot of reflection on the part of Janie while she remembers her grandmother's justification for getting her married and for getting her married in this particular way. And it also triggers Janie's own disillusionment about the meanings of marriage, about the meanings of love, about the eternal disappointment of love in a world where marriage is so firmly calculated by considerations of safety, protection, and material comfort. But there is also a world in which these considerations become important for a Black woman. So, a lot to unpack, and hopefully, I'll be able to do that by reading from a few quotations from the second chapter. So, the first moment I want to unpack is Janie's description of how she ended up in that situation, which is the situation in which her grandmother saw her or walked in and saw that Janie was kissing a boy. It's a moment that's not scandalous in Janie's own description. Rather, what's important for Janie in her description of it is the intellectual and emotional build-up to it. The sort of mental state Janie was in, which led her or which made it inevitable that she would be caught in that situation. So it's not that Janie is embarrassed that she was caught doing that. It's more important for Janie to try and describe motivated, inspired, and what emotional space was created into which she yearned to always return, but which she would always fail to recreate. And so that is the importance of this moment, not the individual act or not the individual person with whom her grandmother saw her. So what is it? Now, Janie starts with the background, and I'll read from Janie's perspective. And fortunately for us, this is in free indirect discourse. It's not direct speech, so the language is standard English and there's no vernacular. So I won't be destroying this sort of accent. I'm able to read it in standard English. It was a spring afternoon in West Florida. Janie had spent most of the day under a blossoming pear tree in the backyard. She had been spending every minute that she could steal from her chores under that tree for the last 3 days. That was to say, ever since the first tiny bloom had opened. It had called her to come and gaze on a mystery, from barren brown stems to glistening leaf buds, from the leaf buds to snowy virginity of bloom. It stirred her tremendously. How? Why? It was like a flute song forgotten in another existence and remembered again. What? How? Why? This singing she heard that had nothing to do with her ears. The rose of the world was breathing out smell. It followed her through all her waking moments and caressed her in her sleep. It connected itself with other vaguely felt matters that had struck her outside observation and buried themselves in her flesh. Now they emerged and quested about her consciousness. She was stretched on her back beneath the pear tree, soaking in the alto chant of the visiting bees, the gold of the sun, and the panting breath of the breeze, when the inaudible voice of it all came to her. She saw a dust-bearing bee sink into the sanctum of a bloom. The thousand sister calyxes arch to meet the love embrace, and the ecstatic shiver of the tree from root to tiniest branch, creaming in every blossom and frothing with delight. So this was a marriage. She had been summoned to behold a revelation. Then Janie felt a pain, remorseless sweet, that left her limp and languid. And then we are told that she got up from where she was, went over the little garden, field entire. She was seeking confirmation of the voice and vision, and everywhere she found and acknowledged answers. And this long paragraph ends, she longed to be a pear tree, any tree in bloom, with kissing bees singing of the beginning of the world. She was 16, she had glossy leaves and bursting buds, and she wanted to struggle with life, but it seemed to elude her. Where were the singing bees for her? Nothing on the place, nor in her grandma's house, answered her. She searched as much of the world as she could from the top of the front steps, and then went on down to the front gate and leaned over to gaze up and down the road. Looking, waiting, breathing short with impatience, waiting for the world to be made. So, this long description, and I understand that was long, but I think it's important to fully understand the innocence that the narrator is trying to create, even though inviting us to understand and appreciate. Even though innocence might not feel like a very appropriate word because it involves a person wanting to do things which might look as not innocent. The description of this impact that the observation of nature has on Janie. On one hand, it is a very matter of fact, a very ordinary and somewhat common observation. The observation that the natural world is always renewing itself, that the season of spring is the season of renewal, that life always finds a way to burst out of difficulties. Every culture, every agricultural cycle has a celebration of the new season, has a celebration of the harvesting season. And for good reason. It is how societies are remade. It is also the celebration of the fertility of human bodies. And as human bodies are sustained by nature, nature's own fertility is itself the cause for celebration. So far, so good, and this is all very common. But it's important to know that in this case, there is no collective societal celebration. There is no celebration in the world around her. It is just Janie. Janie is one person, and on a spring day, Janie happens to observe a plant, a bee pollinating a flower. And this vision fills Janie with a sense of wonder. And it's a wonder which I think has very little to do with human sexuality, and in fact has everything to do with expanding the very idea of sexuality, in fact, exploding it into such a wide and multifaceted entity that it has very little to do with human beings. And here we have come upon a recurrent theme, a theme that connects this novel to Knightwood by Juna Barnes. And I have paused to remind you all in each of the first 4 chapters of Knightwood how the narrative frequently falls back on images and metaphors from the world of nature. Trees, animals, circus animals, the stems, the leaves of trees, in order to describe the physical features of women. And Knightwood ends with Robin Watt turning into a dog at a circus. So the early 20th century novel, especially as practiced in the hands of these women writers, displays a very powerful capacity to anticipate what is becoming more and more common in the contemporary world Anglophone novel, the tendency to imagine human life as being on a continuum and not separate from lives of other living entities such as plants, but not just limited to plants and trees. There's a tendency to imagine human agency as being existing on the same level, on a continuum, with forms of life who are stationary, but because they are stationary, we tend to see them as somehow lacking agency. Similarly, here with a lot of women protagonists, a lot of women characters, because we tend to see women as, or at least a lot of characters in this novel see these women as not participating in the public world and confined to private spaces, there's a tendency to see these women as stationary or not having real power. And the use of plant metaphors or plant images in order to describe the interiority as well as the complexity of these women challenges that notion that the private is a space that lacks power or lacks agency. Now, in this novel, the vision of spring, the longing to be a pear tree, the longing to be connected to a powerful, self renewing source of life. And that's really what it is. It's not a yearning for an exploration of sexuality, it's a yearning to be connected to a source of life and a source of energy and animation, a source of self renewal, which is more sustainable, less violent, and more connected than human forms of agency are. That is, in fact, what Janie is yearning for when she's 16 and she sees a bee pollinating a flower. But what it is perceived as by others outside her and the person she lives with and the person who cares most for her, her grandmother, it is perceived merely as a desire for sexual activity. And this is what triggers the response in Janie's grandmother, which is to get her married. I'm going to read from a few things that her grandmother tells Janie. So the first thing that grandmother tells Janie is that she has selected a man and his name is Logan Killix, and she's going to have Janie married to this person. They start an argument and Janie protests very powerfully and Janie refuses. Her grandmother tries to explain to her, and one of the things she says is that marriage will help her settle down and help her find stability and also consistency. So first thing that Janie's grandmother says is, so you don't want to marry off decent like, do you? You just want to hug and kiss and feel around with first one man and then another. You want to make me suck the same sorrow your mama did, eh? My old head ain't grey enough. My back ain't bowed enough to suit you. So the very first justification that Janie's grandmother gives in order to defend her decision that Janie should get married to this old rich guy is that Janie should not suffer the fate that her mother suffered. And this is a story that Janie is not aware of at this time and will only learn through what her grandmother will tell her. And the fate, according to Nanny, which Janie's mother suffered, was simply the fate of having multiple partners. We'll find out soon that this is not actually a very accurate interpretation or an accurate representation of what Janie's mother suffered. In fact, Nanny will admit that she is misrepresenting, but it is accurate enough from Nanny's perspective. And so she wants to protect Janie, and this is why she's suggesting this. So this is the first time that we hear of this ideology of protection. and this narrative of safety, this logic that women, especially black women in early 20th century America, needed the support or the shelter given to them by a man in order to preserve their own safety. And for Nanny, the first and most obvious reason to believe it is what happened to Janie's mother. But then again, a little bit later, when Janie protests more, Nanny explains further, and I'll probably end with this. This is among the most powerful quotes from the novel. Nanny asks Janie to sit on her lap and explains to her something about what the history of slavery does to relations among individual black people in contemporary America. This is what Nanny tells Janie. Come to your grandma, honey. Sit in her lap like you used to. Your nanny wouldn't harm a hair on your head. She don't want nobody else to do it neither if she can help it. Honey, the white man is the ruler of everything as far as I've been able to find out. Maybe it's someplace way off in the ocean where the black man is in power, but we don't know nothing but what we see. So the white man throw down the load and tell the nigger man to pick it up. He pick it up because he have to, but he don't tote it. He hand it to his women folks. The nigger woman is the mule of the world so far as I can see. I've been praying for it to be different with you. Lord, Lord, Lord. For a long time she sat rocking with the child, with the girl held tightly to her sunken breast. Janie's long legs dangled over one arm of the chair, and the long braids of her hair swung low on the other side. Nanny half sobbed a running chant prayer over the head of the weeping girl. Now, I'll end very quickly, but a few quick comments before I wrap up. The first thing to note about this speech, which I just read, is that not many novelists would dare to include such a speech in their text. Not many would dare to have this text published with their name on it, mainly because it expresses some very harsh truths, but more than that, it expresses these harsh truths in a language that seems to reinforce the inevitability of these harsh truths. The language is coming from not a very educated, somewhat conservative, and because it's not educated, it appears conservative, but it's actually just real. The dominant impression that I think the narrator wants to convey from this speech of Nanny's is not that Nanny wants to reduce or limit the life of her granddaughter. Rather, the idea is that Nanny is too real. Nanny has seen too much violence and has seen very little redemption, very little potential for all of the tragic things to be reversed. And therefore, the only thing Nanny can change is if she wants Janie to have a good life that is free from violence. The only thing she can do is advise Janie to change her own behavior, to reduce potential, to reduce the possibilities or the occasions for violence to be visited upon her. Now, in order to do this, however, she expresses some thoughts about the essential malice, misogyny, and violence that exists in the world. This is what Hurston meant when she wrote as an anthropologist that one of her tasks as a researcher and as a field worker was to document the ubiquity of malice in the world as it was perceived by poor, rural African American communities. It was an extremely cynical worldview, and the only source of humor or the only source of levity in such a cynical worldview was through folk tales and often quite humorous and often violent stories of things that people could do to each other. This novel is full of quite crude jokes about men and women, about black and white people, which people in the village of Eatonville tell each other. That, the narrator is telling us, is one way in which people who don't have much in the world try to cope with their circumstances. Here, Nanny, who doesn't have much, tries her level best to protect her granddaughter. And the way that she can do that is by asking her to marry quite conservatively. We will see how this decision proves to be tragic, but not really. It's tragic because Janie soon abandons her first husband, but it is also quite positive because it sets up the path for Janie's exploration and empowers Janie to take decisions which prioritize herself and empowers Janie to take risks, to lose everything that she holds familiar in order to take the chance of true happiness. So ultimately, this is a very adventurous novel. It describes the risks that a woman takes, and it describes the process of how this woman learns to build the confidence in order to be able to take the risks that her grandmother and her mother could never have dreamed of taking. I'll stop here and continue in the next lecture. Thank you.